the film has said it all, which makes, I think, makes it very challenging to pose some questions ourselves. Before I do that, let me just start by thanking Tim, who's here with us today, Cleopatra, who made the connection, and of course the Peristianis family, who very generously funded this event and made the event possible through the Universitas Foundation. And as Politeia, we thought it very relevant to what is going on in Cyprus today, what is going on in the world today, to discuss whether the international order, the world system, let's say the international system or the international society, depending which vector of international relations you come from, is relevant. And this is the first question that I would like to pose to Dr. Andreas Mavroyiannis, who is currently a member of the UN Law Commission, but has been a permanent representative to the United Nations, and very specifically was a member of the team of experts which actually proposed Security Council reforms to the UN Secretary General 17 years ago, if I am correct. So Andreas, are you in despair? If you made recommendations to this effect so long ago, and we've seen frustration in the film by people, by ambassadors who tried to put a word in with the powers that be, and nothing happened. Are you optimistic, pessimistic? Will the UN reform or perish?
Thank you.
It's working. It's working. It's working.
It's working?
Yes.
Oh, I don't hear it, but but if you hear it, this is enough, more than enough. Thank you very much, Anna. Good evening to everybody. Welcome to the ambassadors, to Nikos, to Tim, to Cleopatra, and to all of you. Thank you for including me in this event. The question you are asking, Anna, is not easy to be answered, but at the same time, let me tell you that if we take a historical perspective, we will realize that not everything is bad. Nikos mentioned in the beginning, and Tim in the documentary, what the situation was before the United Nations. Therefore, what we have achieved is something. Of course, not enough. And of course, the United Nations as a system goes through a crisis. The crisis, of course, is broader than the UN itself. It's a crisis of multilateralism. It's a crisis of international law. International law has its specificities, the main of those specificities being that you don't have mechanisms of constraints and mechanisms for the implementation. Therefore, it's up to the states to implement or not to implement what the rules are stating. The rules are there and they are very clear. Of course, genocide is not permitted. Of course, violations of human rights are not. Of course. The rules are there and they are very clear. The problem of the world today is implementation. So, if I can, for a couple of minutes, Anna, go back to the beginning, 1945, the inception and the creation of the United Nations. Because, as Nikos mentioned before, and as my friend Prince Zaid was mentioning, you know, in the League of Nations, which was the first effort to have a multilateral body dealing with peace and security, you know, but it failed not only because of the need for unanimity, but also of the lack of overall mechanisms for implementation. So in 1945, the UN was based on the idea of the prohibition of the threat and the use of force in international relations. For this to happen, it was necessary to have a system of collective security. The system of collective security was under the United Nations, and more specifically, it was the mission assigned to the Security Council to carry out the primary responsibility for the maintenance and the restoration of international peace and security. But we had the P5, the winners of the war. So the idea was that no action could be taken against those winners of the war, whilst action, if you read the charter, you will see action is permitted almost freely against the enemy states. But the difference here was the notion of action. The General Assembly has power of recommendation, but it does not have power of taking action that overrides the sovereign equality of states. This is the only organ in the broader international system which has the power to take actions, even to violate sovereignty of states, etc., in order to maintain and restore peace and security. So this is how the system started, but there was a but, and the but was the P5. The P5 got the right of veto, which initially meant that the P5 had the right to decide whether the system would operate on a specific issue, or whether at the end of the day, one issue and the way the UN was dealing with this was within the framework of international collective security effort. And they were able to exclude. So this was the initial idea. But it went, of course, well beyond this, because, for instance, the first vetoes were cast mainly by the Soviet Union and by the United States on issues of admission of new members. In order to have a member admitted at the UN, you needed a resolution by the Security Council, and then the General Assembly would decide. So, in order to prevent on both sides in the Cold War, you were having veto. The same that was happened to Palestine last year. You had a veto preventing the General Assembly at the end of the day to decide the admission of Palestine in the United Nations. Then, let me tell you a very short story. 1950. What do we have? We have the Soviet Union not participating in the work of the Security Council in order to protest the fact that China was represented by Taiwan. Okay, it was after the Chinese Revolution, in Beijing it was the communist regime, etc. But China was continuing to be represented by Taiwan, the Republic of China. So, and Taiwan, this small, relatively small state, was having the right of veto because it was one of the five. So, sometime in 1950, we had the North Korea invasion crossing the line towards South Korea. So, what happened? Meeting of the Security Council, Russia is absent, Soviet Union is absent, and then for the first time, the Security Council is able to take a decision asking member states to assist Korea, and all the operations started like that. And of course, the next day, Soviet Union went back to the Security Council. And then we had the Uniting for Peace resolution, or Acheson resolution, or resolution 377, where, because exactly of the fear that everything would be blocked at the Security Council, there was this possibility when a veto of a permanent member was preventing the Security Council from exercising its primary responsibility, the General Assembly, as Christian was saying, would take up within 10 days and exercise and act in order to restore peace and security. And this happened many times. And we have our friend, the Palestinian ambassador here. Even the recent, if you like, meetings of the General Assembly on the Palestinian issue happened under the procedure of the Uniting for Peace resolution, because the Security Council was not able to take action because of the veto. So it went on like that. 1956, something very close to us, very close to us. It was during the Cyprus revolt against the British, when we had the Israeli, British, French intervention in Sinai in the Suez. There we had a double veto, of course, the French and the British. And you had the Americans and the Soviets acting together in order to create a peacekeeping force which went there to restore peace and security. So by all this, of course, we can talk about for days about this. You know, it so happened that I had special responsibility during my tenure as facilitator for the right of veto. So I went through a lot of work and I interviewed all the P5 and all members. And so on the part on the veto, I was trying to encapsulate all those issues. But in order to not to monopolize the floor, I would say that, of course, the veto is very, very problematic, and it's becoming more problematic because the public opinion around the world today would not condone and would not understand, they would not accept that what was meant initially to protect the interest of the P5 and not to have anything against them happening, today it became so high-handed, so used in a way that people consider that it serves just the arrogant interest of a member state, that people cannot condone it, cannot understand it. But Andreas, give the floor back to Anna, because we are going to talk about changes.
Yes, I mean the question. I mean, you described the historical process and the reason why the veto is there, because a lot of academics would disagree with the academic we saw at the documentary, because they would say, unless we have the veto, the big players it will be a game that the big players will not want to play. So it's possible that if you dismantle the veto, the big powers will not be interested. So there is the French proposal, which was mentioned in the documentary. We keep the veto, but we say we're just using it. Countries should willingly refrain from using it in cases of genocide. So what is your take? I mean, what is your take on this? What would you suggest? Is it possible not to have the veto?
No, it's not possible. It's not possible for a very simple reason. The P5 control the system. As I was saying, they control membership, but more so, they control reform. For a reform or for any changes in the charter to be implemented, you need a 2/3 majority in the General Assembly for the adoption, and then you need ratification by the 2/3 of the members of the United Nations, including all P5. Without them, you cannot reform the system. Therefore, what Zaid and Christian were trying to do a few years ago, and what we have tried to do many a time in the past, was short of revising the charter, which is a non-starter today when it comes to issues like veto. What can we do short of this? And there were these ideas that were mentioned. The need to have 2 vetoes at least, the need to have a gentleman's agreement that you don't use the veto in cases of mass destruction or humanitarian catastrophes and genocide, etc. But this never really happened because inside the group of the P5 there are fundamental disagreements. And it was very clear also what was mentioned at a certain point in the documentary about China. China tries to every extent possible to avoid using the veto. But how do they do this? By telling everybody the limits within they operate. So everybody knows that if you go beyond this, it will be vetoed. So the threat of the veto works also its course, except, as I was saying before, in cases where you use the mechanism of the Uniting for Peace, where the Security Council sends the issue to the General Assembly. As it is we are still now at the 10th special session for Palestine, and it goes on. Now, we need to bear in mind, however, what I said in the beginning about this supranational element that is the only one. Of course, here we are used to it because we are European, we have it in the European Union. But in the international system, it's the only case, the Security Council, where you can have binding decisions upon all member states. This happens because of the nature of the Security Council. So when you go to the General Assembly under the mechanism of the Uniting for Peace, you don't have it. You don't have it. You have recommendations. Recommendations, if there is the political will to act, can make the difference. As I was mentioning, the peacekeeping force in the Sinai in '56, because there was political will. But if there is no political will, there is no way you can impose. And all the chapter 7 of the charter is about the Security Council taking action in cases of threat or violation of peace and security.
So that brings me to the other question posed in the documentary. If it's a political issue, as you've very eloquently described, it's a reflection of the balance of power, really. This is how the security architecture was designed very, very specifically to make sure there's a balance of power. And when you have a balance of power, then it's more unlikely to have a war breaking out. Should this matter then be taken to the court to decide?
Yes, but you are facing exactly the same problem. Who is going to implement the decisions of the court? And of course, when we're talking about the ICJ, only member states can take cases to the court for decision. The UN, what they can do, they can ask the court for an advisory opinion. And of course, many a time, the United Nations, the General Assembly, and even the Security Council, in the case of Namibia, asked for advisory opinions. The ambassador is here. Do you remember the advisory opinion on the wall? Okay, what happened? There was an advisory opinion. So, and there are advisory opinions time and again. The problem is implementation. Not everything is black in this situation. We had, I have to tell you, one very, very good and very productive case, which happened just a few years ago when Mauritius asked the General Assembly to adopt a resolution to ask the International Court of Justice about the Chagos Islands. And then, indeed, I was there. Jagdish Bujul is a close friend of mine. We worked together. So, and eventually, there was a request for an advisory opinion. The advisory opinion was saying that the United Kingdom couldn't continue to claim that the Chagos Islands are sovereign. I don't know if it reminds you something. And you see that we have now on the part of the UK implementation. We have implementation. It's not to say that they are withdrawing completely from the area, but they operate now within the framework defined by the advisory opinion, in the sense that they negotiate an agreement with Mauritius that, you know, our presence here is based on an agreement between Mauritius and the United Kingdom. So you see, there are things you can do, but you need also to be aware that this is why I was saying in the beginning, it's about implementation, which, by the way, and this is something maybe was not very, very clear, it's a different thing, the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice. Because for the International Criminal Court, implementation is a given because it's about individuals and you have to have them in front of you. So when you decide on their fate, they go to jail. The problem with the International Criminal Court is whether, and this was very clear in the documentary, whether you have the Security Council referring cases to the International Criminal Court, and whether you are in a position, as you have seen this year, that warrants were issued by the prosecutor against Netanyahu and against other people, and including some Hamas people. But whether it will be possible to bring them before the court is another story.
So is everything going? I think what you've said, Andreas, so far is rather on the pessimistic side, if I'm allowed to pass judgment on what you said. And you know, the big question, which is not easy to answer, and I don't think we'll answer it here tonight, is, you know, is the international order being dismantled? You know, is the UN still relevant? Is it becoming more obsolete? And you know, it reminds me, if we go a little bit back in history, further back than the League of Nations, if we go back in history, in European history, after the Napoleonic Wars, the great powers of Europe tried to come together through the concert of Europe so they could block France from rising again. But they included France to make sure that they sort of engaged it, you know, a bit similar to what happened to Germany after the Second World War with the European Union. And they tried, and then it didn't work at some point. And then George Canning, you know, being the Brit, you know, he said that the famous phrase, you know, every nation for itself and God for us all. So, you know, is this what the international system is coming to? And you know, this is the question that really concerns us as Cypriots, because we depend on UNFICYP, for example, for security. What happens if next time we go to the Security Council to renew the resolution, to renew the mandate, it's vetoed? It's a real question, not only of security, but also because the mandate of UNFICYP is to be here until the normal state of affairs is restored. So if they leave, it's a political thing as well, because a political statement is being made that the normal state of affairs has been restored. So just very brief, your take on it. Where are we heading, and should we be worried as Cypriots?
We all have to be worried, I think. And as Cypriots, we need also to be aware that it takes just one permanent member vetoing a resolution in order for UNFICYP to withdraw. We need to be aware of this. We managed so far on the Cyprus issue not to have these kind of controversies between the P5. They are unanimous, and every year the renewal happens with no real problems. However, you would recall that 8 years ago, for instance, when Nikki Haley was the American ambassador to the UN, she was questioning the presence of the peacekeeping forces, including AMFISIP. So eventually, you needed to prove that it has real added value, and of course, I mean, we were far from reaching a deadlock and a veto, but the question was raised, and we need to be conscious that, I mean, here in Cyprus, we are used to have the peacekeeping force for 60 years now, and we think it's part of the landscape. It's not. It's not. And it's not only this. We have also all the resolutions of the Security Council and the framework that defines the parameters of the settlement and all those things. And there again, we always need the presence of the United Nations and the understanding of the P5. Our main work in New York is working on the P5 and to persuading them about, and there was just one case of a veto concerning Cyprus. It was in April 2004, a week before the referendum on the Annan plan. And it was cast by Russia, but it was not cast because it was affecting fundamental interests of Russia, etc., but because they felt that it was falling short of what a resolution by the Security Council should be at the time. So to come back to what you are saying, the glass is not half empty for me, it's half full. I'm not always very optimistic, I'm always determined, but I believe honestly that the UN over the last 80 years, and this year we're celebrating the 80 years of the United Nations, have done an enormous job. Probably in the field of peace and security there were shortcomings. There were also achievements, but as the current report of the Secretary General to the General Assembly on the UN 80, we can divide the work today of the United Nations into 4 areas. Peace and security, where this is the one we're discussing the most, but there is the humanitarian, there is development, and there is human rights. All those issues were part of the Agenda 2030 about the Sustainable Development Goals. Of course, we didn't manage to achieve the Millennium Development Goals, and I'm sure we're not going to manage to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Is it to say that there is nothing? No. We need to persist, we need to continue working, we need to operate. There are no easy ways in international relations because there is no constraint. We need persuasion, we need cooperation, we need additionality, we need a lot of things. The idea now, for instance, within the 4 parameters I defined, is also because the United Nations, because of the financial crisis, need to reduce the budget by 20% overall. 20%. Imagine it's huge, 20%. So we will need to have complementarities. We will have agencies that will mix, and we're going to have a lot of things. But we should never underestimate the work the UN is doing, in particular when it comes to Asia, to Africa, to Latin America, in terms of development, in terms of humanitarian, in terms of health, in terms of education. There are shortcomings, but we need to persist.
Okay, we already we need to close the session. We decided not to have any Q&A formally, but the two speakers, Tim and Andreas, have agreed to stay behind for an informal chat for anyone who has questions. I must offer a disclaimer now. I am a member of the UNSWTP team, so I am definitely in favor of the UN, and I do see the good work which has been done through the decades in many fields. But there is one thing that I always keep at the back of my mind, and it bothers me. When we sometimes suffer by projectitis, as someone has said, wrote in our chat group the other day, is that in the peacekeeping mediation, the peacekeeping operations manual, the PKO, there's a clear guideline for all of us who work as experts on UN projects. It says you need to be impartial, but you cannot be neutral when there are violations of human rights and where there are violations of international law. There's a difference between impartiality and neutrality. And this is exactly where the values, I would say, of the UN and what I have just said definitely align with what Politeia is doing. Because if you remain silent when you have violations of human rights and of international law, then your silence speaks for you. And we will not be silent. Thank you very much for being here with us today.